Target 4.4 says I can solve a quadratic function algebraically, either using square roots or the quadratic formula. A couple notes before we begin solving problems on these. First off is we need to be able to decide which method can be used, and that is based on the equation that we are given, or that we're working with. Now, the criteria that we use is, first off, if there are no x terms, or if it looks like the x terms will cancel out on both sides of the equation, then we're going to solve that problem using square roots. Alternatively, if there are x terms in the equation that are not going to cancel out on both sides, then we're going to solve that type of problem, that equation, using the quadratic formula. A few reminders before we get started as well. Very basic concept here, just the idea that making sure everyone understands the square root again means that if we take the square root of x, that means we're looking for the number that we can square that would have given us x. Okay, so your answer is just the opposite of squaring. Okay, and when I say opposite, I guess the technical name for that would be we're finding the inverse of squaring a number. That's what it means when we say take the square root. And then also just a reminder, quadratic formula, that if we want to use the quadratic formula, first off the equation must be in standard form, which looks like ax squared plus bx plus c, and one side of that equation must be equal to 0. So once we have it in standard form, it must equal 0. And again, the formula is just equal. Once you have it in standard form, the quadratic formula tells you what values of x will make that equation equal to 0. And we figure that out by doing the opposite of b over 2a plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And that plus or minus, just kind of redrew that here. Plus or minus just means we go through and we add those two sides there, the negative b over 2a plus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a, and then we turn around and we subtract those values from each other. So that's what the plus or minus means. Make sure that you always go through and add the right side to the left and then subtract the right side from the left. Alright, so let's begin with example question number 1. So it says solve for x when we have negative 3x squared equal to negative 243. When I look at this problem, I notice there are no x terms in this problem, so that means I'm going to use square roots as opposed to the quadratic formula. So first step when you're trying to use square roots is you have to get the x squared alone. In other words, we want to cancel out everything on that one side except for the x squared. So to do that, I had negative 3x squared equal to negative 243. I'm just going to divide both sides by negative 3 because that's going to cancel out the negative 3 in front of the x squared. Alright, since we had negative 3x squared, that's multiplying when we have a number right beside a variable. So the inverse of that is to divide, and that cancels it out, and we're left with x squared equals positive 81, since a negative divided by negative is a positive. And then when I take the square root of both sides, the square root of x squared just gives me x, and the square root of 81 gives us 9, but please remember that it can be positive or negative 9, because positive 9 times positive 9 is positive 81, but also negative 9 times negative 9 is also positive 81. So we get two answers here, plus or minus 9. So that's example 1. Example 2 tells us to solve for x again. It says 5x squared minus 10x equals negative 10x minus 45. Now I notice in this problem that we do have x terms, but if you look, we have the same amount of x terms on both sides. We have negative 10x on the left side and negative 10x on the right side. That means these are going to cancel out. So we're still going to use square roots to solve this problem. So once again, our first step is to get the x squared term alone. Now, what I'm going to do first is I'm going to take the equation and I'm going to immediately cancel out the x's on both sides. And that works by just simply adding 10x to both sides. If we do that, then the negative 10x on the left and the negative 10x on the right both cancel out. And we're just left with 5x squared equals negative 45. Now to get rid of the 5 in front of the x squared, that's multiplied, so the inverse function of multiplying is dividing. They cancel each other out, so divide both sides by 5. Those 5's cancel, and we're left with x squared equals negative 9. And then we just go through to find x, we take the square root. And so the square root of x squared is equal to the square root of negative 9, but This should throw up a little red flag and alert that we have the square root of a negative number here, square root of negative 9. Well, we can't take the square root of a negative number because the only way to multiply two things and get a negative is if one is positive and one is negative. Well, that's not the definition of squaring a number because you have to multiply it times itself. So you'd either be doing a positive times a positive or a negative times a negative. All right, in both cases, our answer would have to be positive in those situations. So since we can't take the square root of a negative, we just simply say that there are no real solutions to this problem. All right, so that's our answer, and that's going to come up occasionally. Again, remember, anytime you're solving a quadratic problem, quadratic equation, you can end up with, most often you'll have two solutions, but you can have zero solutions, or as we said here, no real solutions. And then the third option is sometimes you can have just one solution, but that's going to be when you end up with zero, in particularly as being part of the equation. So either, for instance, if we were solving square roots and we got x squared equal to 0, well, we're only going to get one answer because the square root of 0 is just 0. Because you could say positive 0 or negative 0, it's the same thing. So that we would only have one answer there. Okay, and then sometimes when you're working out using the quadratic formula, you can also have one answer. So just be aware that if you ever just get one answer, that's not necessarily wrong. Just make sure that at some point in the problem you were asked to take the square root of 0. Okay, that's when you know you're going to have one solution. All right, let's go ahead and try example number 3 now. This one says solve for x again, and it says 4x squared plus 8x plus 7 equals 4. Now I look at this problem, and I notice that we do have x terms, and they aren't going to cancel out this time. Right, we have 8x on the left, there's no x's on the right. That means they're not going to be able to cancel each other out on both sides. So we're going to use the quadratic formula here. All right, to do that, our first step is one side has to equal 0. Remember, it's got to be in standard form, and one side of the equation must equal 0. So to get that right side equal to 0, I'm going to take away 4 from both sides. And when I do that, I'm left with 4x squared plus 8x plus 3 equals 0. Now, it's in standard form. The right side is equal to 0, so I can use the formula. Notice I have the x squared terms written first, then the x term, and then the number term, the constant term, where it's just a number by itself there at the end. So my a is equal to 4, b is equal to 8, and c is equal to 3, and they're all positive. So I'm going to take the quadratic formula, and I'm going to replace a, b, and c with those values. Then all I'm going to do is sort of step by step go through and simplify. First off, the easy thing to simplify is the 2 times 4 on the bottom. Those are both going to become 8s. 2 times 4 is 8. And then under the square root, I have negative 8 squared. Negative 8 times negative 8 gives me positive 64. Please, please, please be careful if you ever type that in your calculator. If you just type in negative 8 squared, the calculator is probably going to say negative 64 is the answer. Again, the calculator does not know. When you type that in as just negative 8 squared with no parentheses, the calculator thinks you want to take 8 squared, whatever answer that is, and then make it negative. Okay, and that's not what we want to do here. So if you're ever trying to square a negative number in the calculator, you have to put parentheses around that negative number so that it knows the negative symbol goes with the number inside there. So negative 8 times negative 8, or negative 8 squared, gives us 64. And then I have minus 4 times 4 times 3. Well, 4 times 4 times 3 gives us positive 48. So I'm subtracting 48 here. And when I simplify that down a little bit, over here on the left side, the negative 8 divided by 8 is just negative 1 now. And then underneath the square root, 64 minus 48 gives me 16. Simplify that just a little bit more, just a couple more steps here. So the square root of 16 is equal to 4. Notice I don't have to put a plus or minus here when we take that square root because the plus or minus is already there in the middle. That's why we have that plus or minus in between when we use the quadratic formula, because when you take the square root, as you saw in example problem 1, you can use either a positive or a negative number to be the solution there. So that's why we have that plus or minus in the middle. So we have negative 1 plus or minus 4 over 8. 4 over 8 as a fraction that reduces to 1/2 or 0.5. So I have negative 1 plus or minus 0.5. And now that I've got it down to really as simple as I can make it before I actually do the adding and subtracting, I'm actually going to go over here and write it out as two separate things. So I know x is either equal to negative 1 plus 0.5 or x is also equal to negative 1 minus 0.5. So I'm actually doing the plus or minus part right here. So negative 1 plus 0.5 gives me negative 0.5, and then on the right side, negative 1 minus 0.5 gives me negative 1.5. So I have negative 0.5, negative 1.5. Those are my two answers. At this point, I'm not going to write it out, but to double check your answer, go back to the original equation, 4x squared plus 8x plus 7. And if you replace the x's in that equation with negative 0.5, you should it should work out that 4x squared plus 8x plus 7 will actually equal 4 when you plug that in. And the same thing happens if you replace x with negative 1.5. You'll also get 4 as your answer. So it's always a good idea to check your work. If you have questions about how to check your work or what that would actually look like, just let me know, and I'd be glad to sit down and help you. So there are several examples right there. You'll see several additional practice problems in the files on my webpage and linked down below. So work those out, check your solutions with that file, and then finally, good luck on the target earn back questions. Make sure you try each one, and hopefully you can earn that target back. All right.